Okay, so tonight we're going to be looking at the French and Indian War. And the guiding question I want you to keep in mind with this is, how did the French and Indian War lead to colonist dissatisfaction? So what about the French and Indian War made the colonists unhappy? And eventually leading to revolution. So what did the French and Indian War do to make the colonists so angry that they eventually went to war? Because the French and Indian War is one of the big causes of the American Revolution. And we're going to be looking at all of those causes this week, but the French and Indian War is probably one of the biggest of those causes. So leading up to the war, and I want you to keep in mind that all of this is going on during those periods of colonization that we were talking about. So we looked at the three major colonial regions. So those colonial regions were being established and growing pretty quickly while all of this is going on. So first of all, France claims Western lands. The French explorers spent a lot of time claiming areas in the Ohio River Valley specifically. Then that was the land west of the Mississippi River. And you're going to see a paper slide following this video that shows the maps of the French and Indian War, so hopefully that will give you a little bit more of a picture of what's going on. They also claimed the Mississippi River Valley and the entire Great Lakes region. So the Mississippi River Valley is places, specifically it's Louisiana was the big one. So New Orleans was a big part of the Mississippi River Valley. It's a big port as well, so you have lots of goods being shipped in and out of that port. The main settlements were Quebec and Montreal, and both of those are in Canada. So you can get an idea, if you've got French territory all the way from the port of New Orleans up to Canada, that's a big chunk of land that the French had control of during this time period. Most of the money that they made was off of the fur trade. British women and European women in general loved to wear their big fancy furs, and so the French were making a lot of really good money off of this. So Native American alliances. The Native Americans obviously were the people who were providing those furs to the French. The British also wanted to get in on this Native American fur trade. So the Native Americans ended up competing over who was going to supply specifically the French furs, because they knew that the French were making the most money on this. This led to a French alliance with the Algonquin tribes and the Huron tribes. And the English then formed an alliance with the Iroquois nation, which was made up of several tribes. And one of the things that was leading up to this war was that the Iroquois were starting to claim more and more lands, especially lands that were heavy for those fur trading. The French and British provided weapons to the Iroquois nation and the Algonquin nation in order to keep them on their side. So that was one of the big things that they traded with. And also they knew that those weapons would eventually lead to the defense, that the Native Americans would come to the defense of the British and the French. So conflict in the Ohio River Valley. The British fur traders began moving into the Ohio River Valley during the 1750s, and keep in mind that that was French land. So in order to keep the British out of the valley, the French soldiers began to attack British trading posts. Now these trading posts were not huge by any means, but they did allow a chain of trade to occur throughout that Ohio River Valley settlement. The British traders left, and the French then began to build forts in order to protect their lands. So the British realized that they really don't want to lose this area. So Virginia's governor, and remember that Virginia is probably one of the larger colonies at this time, sent 40 men, including George Washington, to build a fort at the head of the Ohio River Valley. It's where Pittsburgh is located today. As this is being built, the French seized the fort and completed its construction in 1754. They named it Fort Duquesne. That's how you pronounce that. It's Duquesne. Obviously, English are not very happy that the French seized this fort. So George Washington realizes the importance of establishing a fort. So he builds a second smaller fort. This is called Fort Necessity. The French and their allies ended up attacking Fort Necessity on July 3rd of 1754. The British were not prepared for a fight, so they ended up having to surrender, and the French let George Washington march back to Virginia unharmed. And a lot of historians see that as kind of one of the big mistakes that the French made throughout this process. This was the start of the French and Indian War, and the French and Indian War was part of a larger war, which was the 7 Years' War, and that 7 Years' War was all between Great Britain and France. And it was their attempts to try to get these new colonies and to expand their empire. So that was 1756 to 1763. So one of the ways that the colonists reacted to all of this was going on at the start of the war was the Albany Plan of Union. And this was actually proposed by Benjamin Franklin, who we're going to start to talk about right much because he had a really big involvement in United States affairs at this time. So the British colonists met with the 6 Iroquois nations, and they began to plan a way to fight this war well. Plan was called the Albany Plan of Union. So essentially what it said was that each of the 13 colonies would send a representative to this Grand Council, which would be the government. This council would collect taxes, make treaties, and start new settlements. So it really kind of formed this government system that had not been formed previous to this point. The plan did not work out. It was a great plan and it was a great thought at the time, and people look back on that plan and see it as the first seeds of our government. But it didn't work out because the individual colonies did not want to lose their governing powers. But it did bring to light the idea that we needed to unite together in order to fight the French and Indian War. So the battles, and we're not going to go really heavily into the battles of the French and Indian War just because it's not overall as important to our studies as the Revolutionary War is. So the first one, Braddock's defeat. The British sent General Edward Braddock to Virginia. Then from Virginia, he marched to Fort Duquesne, took 2,100 men and a really, really large cannon on this voyage. Now keep in mind, at this time, soldiers are walking by foot. So the thought of dragging that cannon, it really, really slowed down their process a lot. Fewer than 900 French and Indians ended up surprising Braddock's forces along his way to Fort Duquesne. Braddock came from this traditional military background, and he refused to break his lines. And we'll see this in a video that we're going to watch later on, but the British would fight, and really wars at this time were fought, line against line. So people would stand and just shoot at each other. There wasn't this hiding and the guerrilla warfare that we see today. Now, George Washington really was a fan of the idea of that guerrilla warfare, and he thought it was stupid that these people were just fighting line to line. Braddock ended up having like 4 or 5 horses shot out from underneath him because he refused to give up these lines. So in the end, over 1,000 soldiers were killed or injured, and the British lost this battle. But things are going to change when there's a new Secretary of State, and his name is William Pitt. He really, really wanted the British to win this branch of the 7 Years' War. So he sent some of the strongest British generals to the Americas in order to find this success. By 1759, the British controlled 7 of the French forts, which was a huge deal. Their last attack was to go to Quebec, which was one of the big French strongholds. They wanted to do this secretly, so they actually ended up attacking at night. The French were surprised, and Quebec eventually fell to the British. This was considered the turning point in the war, so this is one of the big things to remember. But after this point, really the French kind of lost control and ended up losing the war. So the Treaty of Paris, despite the British victory in the Americas, the French and the British continue to fight in other areas for that colonization and that imperialism, that idea of spreading. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Great Britain had won. So the Treaty of Paris is what ends the war in America. And the Treaty of Paris is going to be one of those things that eventually leads America, or leads the colonists to being really frustrated. So in the Treaty of Paris, Britain claimed all lands east of the Mississippi River. Spain was given all of the French territory that was west of the Mississippi River because they had offered to help out. So that included New Orleans, Louisiana, and any of the French territory west of the Mississippi River. The treaty essentially ended the French power in North America. So this was the first Treaty of Paris. It's going to lead to a lot of problems in the Revolution. So what I want us to keep in mind is the guiding question: how did this lead to the American Revolution? I'm not going to answer it right now because I want you to spend some time thinking about it based on the notes that you just took. And I will see you guys in class tomorrow. Have a great one.